Okay, so welcome to listening to the findings of the just about finished project, Learning and Being in Sport, a Phenomenological Investigation. And I am Nora Onkainen. I am one of the people in the research team who have been involved in this project for the last 2 years, and it's EU Horizon 2020 funded research under the Marie Curie actions. And so in our project, what we have looked into doing is to explore existential learning in sport. And just to tell you a little bit about the background, why we are interested in this. So there's a long-held assumption and belief that sport has an educational dimension, and it's something that plays an important cultural and social and recreational role. And for example, the European Commission has been promoting sport-related issues very actively, for example, in the white paper on sport and also in the dual career guidelines for athletes. And even if this has been a very strong dimension in policy, there are a lot of debates and lack of clarity on what the educational dimension of sport actually is, and what do we learn in sport and how do we learn in sport. And so dominant approaches to looking into these issues include the sport-based youth development programs. And within that ideology and that approach, there is the so-called life skills approach and life skills development. That has been one area that has been gaining a lot of attention. However, there are some critiques of these approaches in terms of whether there is sufficient evidence for these approaches and these interventions, but also on ideological grounds, and that's something I will be discussing in a moment. And so in our study, we wanted to extend our understandings of informal learning, and we wanted to do that by looking at existential learning in sport. And that was the main contribution of the project that we have done. And as I mentioned, this is a Marie Curie fellowship from the EU Horizon 2020 program. And I have been what they call within this framework, the so-called experienced researcher. So the one who is conducting the empirical research and doing the work. And the project supervisor has been Dr. Tatjana Riba at the University of Jyväskylä. And here you see all the members of the team who have been involved in putting this project together. And so Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, Professor Kenneth Agerholm and Lars Tore Rungland, they have been active as the secondment institution. So I've spent 6 months as a visiting researcher as a part of this project. And then in the UK, we have Professor Jacqueline Allen Collinson and Rob Morris, who have been developing this project together with us. And we were also going to have some research visits during the second year of the project, but unfortunately with the COVID situation, those were some of the things that we couldn't be doing the research visits, but of course we've been able to collaborate and do workshops and Zoom meetings and that kind of things. And so here is the overview of what we've done in the Learn2 project. So the work package 1 was data collection. The second work package was data analysis. Work package 3 was the so-called secondment, as it's called in these Marie Curie actions. And then the work package 4 for us was manuscript preparation. And then, of course, we have these communication and dissemination activities that I'll mention in a moment. And so I'll start by explaining the empirical component and how we have designed the study. So Learn2 has been connected to the Finnish dual career study. It has been an extension of this work that is led by Tatjana Ryba, and that has been ongoing at the University of Jyväskylä already for 5 years. And so with Learn2, we extended that project in scope, but also collecting more data within this longitudinal study where the same participants have been interviewed already several times. And so within this Learn2 project, we conducted the 6th round of qualitative interviews with youth athletes from Finnish upper secondary sports schools. And the participants were from different parts of Finland. And with this broader study, the interest has been on looking at how youth athletes construct their dual career development pathways. The project has looked at motivation, identity, future orientation, well-being and burnout, among other things. And with the Learn2 project, we have extended that to looking at informal learning in and through sport. And within the Learn2, we have specifically done the interviews at the time when a lot of these participants have been in crossroads in their lives. So some of them have been deciding to disengage from competitive sport. Others have been transitioning to senior sport. Some of them have been obtaining professional contracts. So it has been this kind of quite critical time in these young people's lives. And as a part of this existential learning framework that I'll talk about in a moment, we have been interested in understanding what kind of learning occurs in encounters with discontinuous experiences. And so in the theoretical work within the Learn2 project, we wanted to be extending the understandings of learning in sport, of informal learning in sport, from life skills, which has been one of the dominant approaches, to consider existential learning as an alternative form of learning. And the theoretical paper has been published in Sport Education and Society. You can find it there for the full argument. But for here, I'll just briefly explain what we have done in that study. So basically, we wanted to develop our existential learning framework, and we wanted to be looking at some issues, doing an analysis of this life skills approach, and then looking at how these are different and how existential learning can extend and also complement the approaches that are already being developed in the studies of youth learning in sport. So we looked at what, how, and why within these both frameworks. And in life skills, we see that often the focus is on developing different skills and different competencies. For example, goal setting, teamwork, problem solving, these kind of things. And there has been a push towards formalizing these life skills so that they would be something that is taught across different programs in recreational and youth sport. Typically, the content of learning is something that is positive, something that helps young people to function in the society, and something that they will actively produce. Whereas existential learning, how we understand it, the content is really about the way that you are in the world, the way you find meaning and value in life, the way that your understanding of yourself, of your relationships, and the world more broadly, how that changes, how you learn new dimensions about life. And this type of learning is something that can include both positive and negative experiences. And I'll elaborate on that when we look at the empirical data. We also think that existential learning is not necessarily something that is actively always sought for and produced by the person who is learning, but it's more about us encountering things in life that are thrown to us. So, for example, a youth athlete doesn't choose to get injured, but when they encounter injury, they will learn something from that, whether they want it or not. In many cases, not always, but that's a potential learning experience when we are thrown into something that is unexpected and surprising. And when we look at how this learning occurs, in life skills, often the focus is on teacher-led and coach-led type of learning. So often we could talk about adding different skills to the toolbox. For example, that the coach is designing a session that today we are going to be learning, let's say, goal setting as a part of our session in sports. And within that life skill debate, there has been a lot of discussion whether sport is something that teaches you life skills just by participation, or whether the teacher or the coach, we can talk about sports psychologist, has to be intentionally and actively teaching things. And the latter perspective is something that is dominant in the current debates. So just by playing sport, we don't necessarily learn these skills. There has to be an active component from the part of the instructor or the coach. And in our existential framework, yes, we consider that good and well, but what we want to be emphasizing is that other type of learning, this more informal learning that is not intentional and not sought for, is also something that is going to happen, whether we want it or not. And that perspective is also supported by the studies on informal learning at the workplace. So whatever is the official career development programs and this kind of professional skills programs, the people in the workplace will also learn in other situations, whether we want it or not. And we found it that it's important to highlight that even if we are trying to actively teach certain things, we also need to understand this informal type of learning that is not fully in our control. And specifically in the existential framework, and we are drawing from philosopher of education, Otto Friedrich Bollnow, and his work has emphasized this discontinuous types of learning. So what we learn when we encounter discontinuity. And then finally, the why dimension of learning. And in life skills, often the justifications why we need this is in terms of supporting young people in their employability, productivity, adaptation to society, that kind of things. Whereas the existential learning is more about critical awareness, how we are attuned to life, how we find meaning in life, how we find value in life, how we define our values. And so in certain sense, some of the things that we learn might not be something that make us productive or more employable, but they contribute to the way we are in the world and the way we make choices in life. And so for the full argument in the paper, I'd recommend just looking at the paper. So these are the main things there, but so more nuanced explanation of the argument is then found in the paper. And then just to say a little bit about the empirical work that we have done. So we've written 3 papers that focus on existential learning and this type of discontinuous learning, and looking at in the empirical data what youth athletes learn when they encounter discontinuity. And I'll first talk a little bit about this paper, Restoring Harmony in the Life World, Identity, Learning, and Leaving Pre-Elite Sport. And in this study, we wanted to look at retirement from youth sport or pre-elite sport. So our participants are pursuing sport in the talent development pathway. So they were highly motivated and striving towards becoming elite athletes at the beginning of the study. But then, as we know, many discontinuities happen, and actually very few athletes in the talent development pathway reach the senior elite sport. And so we wanted to look at this learning experience in encountering discontinuity and finding a different way of being and living that doesn't involve elite sport anymore. And so the focus was on this discontinuity and drawing on these phenomenological ideas, existential ideas. We wanted to look at different dimensions of the life world. So we looked at the bodily dimension, how you learn a different type of being as a physical being after you are no longer an elite athlete. We wanted to look at how the young athlete learns a different way of inhabiting the space, a different way of inhabiting the culture, finding a different type of identity. We know that identity is something that is personal, but it's also cultural and social, and being part of certain groups and not others. And then we looked at the new way of how that young person is orienting towards time. And so what we found in this discontinuity is that it can be very difficult to bridge the gap from being a talented athlete to being something like what our participant in this case study is talking about, being a normal person. And so if we look at the table 3 below, after athletic retirement, she is finding that her body is the wrong size. She's saying that she is now fat, and it's the wrong type of body. So an athlete wants to be muscular, whereas if you are no longer an athlete, those muscles are completely useless. And she's saying that she wants to look like a normal person. In terms of space, she wants to claim a different type of space. She doesn't want to go to the sporting space. She doesn't want to go to the slope anymore, because that's reminding her of something that she is no longer doing and of somebody she doesn't want to be anymore. And also this person wants to move on from that old space in terms of her home and the old life as it was. So retiring from sport is a completely new beginning for her. And then finding a new identity and fitting in a different type of culture. So she's trying to fit into the exercising culture, and what kind of exercise activities are so-called normal for a person who is not an athlete. And that's very challenging for her. How to train, when to train, why to train. So that is a very confusing time for her, to try to develop a new relationship, a new meaning in movement, when it's no longer for improving your athletic abilities and winning competitions. So she finds it very difficult to develop new meaning in movement for her. And then this temporal orientation with our case study with this participant, how she is thinking about time, is thinking that she had this chapter in her life when she was an athlete, but now she has started a new chapter, and that is no longer about being an athlete. So she has separate chapters in life, and that athlete chapter is something that has been closed and it's left behind. And again, you can find the full story in that article, and this is a little glimpse of the findings. Then I'll talk a little bit about the second paper we wrote. So we have been focusing on the gendered element of learning as well. And when we looked at how gender might be informing and shaping the learning experiences, we found it quite interesting and intriguing to look at this learning not to be perfect, as we put it in this paper. So we looked at how we saw it in the longitudinal data that a lot of the young women who were part of the longitudinal study, they were really sometimes struggling because they were trying to be perfect in everything they do. So they tried to be perfect in sport and they tried to be perfect at school. And sometimes it's not possible to be perfect in everything. And if you come into this kind of situation, what are you going to do? And how do you learn to adjust to that situation? Are you learning not to be perfect, or are you learning somehow to live up to this perfect ideal? And so at the data analysis, we were looking at how do these young women, 10 participants, how are they doing that? And we saw that there are 3 ways that these young women are dealing with all these pressures and these different achievement domains in their life. And when we are using existential phenomenological thinking, we were specifically interested in time. What kind of lived time do they have? How do they orient to time? And so we looked at the stories of these young athletes, and we saw 3 types of stories. So the first one was something where you are living up to the perfect ideal. And what we saw, a little bit maybe surprising, when we say that somebody is living up to the perfect ideal, they actually said that you don't need to be perfect every day. So if you have one bad day in the training or at school, that's okay. But in the broader horizon, so they all had this long-term perspective. They had their ideas about who they will become and what they are studying or how they are studying and where they are playing sports. So they were extending several years ahead of them. So one bad day in this big horizon of time actually doesn't matter. And these young women often talked about being in control of time, having time, and also making time for themselves. Whereas then we had those participants who were really struggling to be perfect. And for them, the time horizon was more about today. So training session today has to be perfect. It has to be better than last time, better than yesterday. And so it was very much about every day I have to be able to do this. And so in contrast to the first type of story, there is really no room for mistakes. And often we saw that in this type of orientation to time, then you will have some difficult time, because most of us know from our everyday lives that it's quite difficult to be perfect every day. And then the final type of story that we saw, ditching the perfect ideal, we had some young women who felt that they had enough. So they decided that they will stop doing sport, stop engaging in the talent pathway. Some of them also thought of having a gap year after finishing education. So they really wanted to be no more striving to be perfect in anything. And some of them talked about reclaiming their own time, that they had been running after things and that they didn't have time. Time was stolen from them. All the things they had to do was stealing their time. So they wanted to be reclaiming their own time and having time, and not running after all these things all the time. So that's a brief summary of what we have done in this study. The whole paper is available as well. And then this third paper is still in the review process. And so this is really the paper where we have taken the theoretical approach that we developed, and we have focused on looking at the data that we have collected through this idea of existential learning. And so this paper is still in the process, but I'll share a couple of interesting findings from this work. And I mentioned earlier that existential learning is very much about how we are in the world and how we relate to others. How are we occupying this intersubjective space? And so what we saw very clearly was that these young athletes, in these interviews that we did in this particular project, but also in the broader longitudinal study, so there has been this constant negotiation between being there for yourself and being there for others, and how the others are there for you. And so we found that those young athletes who disengaged from sport, there was a shift of the way they are in relation to others. So for example, this one young athlete was saying that as an athlete, you would just think about yourself, and everybody else is working there to help you succeed. So the coach is focused on you, the parents are focused on you, and everything depends on you. So a few of these athletes were saying that after they disengaged from the talent pathway, they were thinking about their life as being very much centered on themselves, and they wanted to broaden the way they are, and also to do things for others, to be more relational, and being more considerate of other people, and sometimes putting the needs of other people more often ahead of the needs of your own. But that was a reflection that arose with several athletes about if athletes are selfish or not. And so we also saw that there was one of these young women who thought that as an athlete she actually was not selfish, and she was talking about this time perhaps being stolen from her, what I already mentioned in relation to the earlier slide, that she said that she hasn't been selfish at all, that she feels that she was often going along with other people's needs and desires, so what her father wants, or coach, or others invested in sport. And so she's saying that maybe she should have been a little bit more selfish when she is and not always going along with what other people would like her to do, how much to train, where to compete, how to organize her life. So we see that this is an ongoing tension, and in line with this existential thought, there is no simple solution that now you find it and after that it's going to be a perfect harmony, but it's something that we will always have tensions in how we relate to other people. And these stories from young athletes demonstrate how they become aware of this through often in these moments of discontinuity. So for example, in this case, when you disengage from sport, this kind of relationships that you were not aware of, they will become more visible to you, because that relatedness changes after you are no longer a talented athlete. Also, what I think is quite interesting in this, looking at existential learning, and when we look at the athletes who transition to senior sport and might get an athlete scholarship or a professional contract, and a few of them were saying that that was actually a discontinuous experience for them. So for example, some of them were saying that life became like quite monotonous. So every day is the same. You eat, you train, you sleep, you do it again. And we had one young athlete whose quote is on the slide, who actually decided to disengage from sport after he had obtained a professional contract, and not too long after that, because he found that the elite athlete's life was not something that he wanted to live. So when he's saying that he would be going to training and everything else in his life would be focused on being better tomorrow than yesterday, he also says that he couldn't do what he wanted to do because he had to be focusing on being better in sport. And he also, this is a young football player, and he's saying that he was quite a perfectionist. So when I talked about the women and learning not to be perfect, certainly that's not something that only the young women need to learn, but also the young men need to learn that. So he was focusing, doing everything perfectly, eating well, sleeping well, resting well, doing everything that he needs to do to be at his best in sport. And then he says that it started to feel like a burden, whereas earlier it was something that he wanted to do. And also other athletes were talking about the need for them to be learning to deal with spending quite a lot of time at home, maybe not going out when their friends are going out, and living this athlete life that might be quite simple and certainly not that glorious. And maybe it was something that was unexpected for them. So maybe the stories that they hear in the media about professional athletes and elite athletes didn't really match their lived reality of starting to live that life. Then I'll just briefly mention that the Learn2 and the interviews that we have done as a part of the Learn2 project are also part of the bigger project, the Finnish longitudinal dual career study. And we also looked at, within that broader project, we have looked at the longitudinal data, and we have looked at how different identity positions shape dual career construction. So I already mentioned that in the data that we have looked at, some young athletes have decided to stop doing competitive sport. Others have transitioned to senior sport, elite sport. And so this study is looking at those pathways and what helps us to understand that. And yeah, just to summarize a few contributions that we have achieved in Learn2 with our research team. So we have developed this framework of existential learning to inform research and practice in relation to informal learning in youth sport. Our aspiration was to extend the thinking and theorizing and researching in relation to informal learning besides the life skills. So our approach is not an alternative to life skills, but we feel that that can complement the picture and that can shed light on those types of learning that are not typically part of life skills, or they wouldn't be reported necessarily in studies that focus on positive youth developmental life skills, because they are not always the type of positive learning experiences. They might not be increasing athletes' employability, but they are more about how they learn about themselves and the way they are in the world. So those are valuable learning experiences, but they are different type of learning than what has been studied in many previous studies. In the empirical work, we have been presenting these novel findings on informal learning experiences that haven't been documented in previous studies in this area. And we have also developed recommendations for coaches, for sports psychology practitioners and others working with talented athletes on recognizing these moments of existential learning, or these potential moments of existential learning in sport, and how to support young athletes in in handling these situations when they arise. And then finally, the knowledge that we have developed in this project has been used to inform a development of an online career development course for student athletes in Finland. And so we are hoping that through this work, we can support young athletes in exploring their existential learning, their informal learning experiences, and then to be able to also benefit from that reflection and how that can help them to identify meaningful goals and their values and developing their pathway in life. And so we've had practical activities. We have been part of the Researchers' Night event. As a part of the project, we have developed these videos where former athletes talk about their learning in sport and their pathways and the choices they have made in sport and education. We hope to be bringing diverse voices, diverse stories, different pathways. And so this material can also be educational material for young athletes and help them explore the types of learning in sport. And so we had various lovely meetings. We had workshops, we had research group meetings. I would especially like to thank the Dual Career Research Group at the University of Jyväskylä. We've had a lot of constructive, critical, very good research meetings where we have developed these ideas. I also like to thank Kenneth Agerholm at the University of, at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, who has been an active, he had an active contribution in the project. Being a visiting researcher at their institution, we had a symposium there where we discussed meaning in sport and also the findings of this work. And so everything that has been produced in this project can be found in the ResearchGate, where we have the project website, all the presentations, all the publications, other updates can be found over there, and also at the university website at the University of Jyväskylä. And so I'd like to thank you for your attention and hope that some of this was stimulating and interesting, and I would love to hear from you if you have some thoughts. And thank you.